Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, let's go to Vancouver and talk about public health. That doesn't sound very snazzy. We want to talk about the intergenerational aspects of public health, both human and environmental and animal, because we have a lot of animal friends who share their health concerns with us. And I'm going to speak with well, I thought I was going to introduce him as a veterinarian, but he's a much broader person than that. He's a public health specialist. And this is Dr. Craig Stephen, who's in, I believe, Vancouver. Is that where you're based right now?
Well, I'm actually on Vancouver Island on the east side there, close to Nanaimo.
Oh, all right. Beautiful place. All right. So fine. Now, you are a professor of public health and population. Tell us more about your role.
Well, what I do now is I have two clinical positions, one at a public health school and one at a veterinary school, but I more or less operate what I call a One Health practice. In other words, I spend a lot of time in academia talking about, in theory, how can I take this approach of thinking about the health of all together into helping with policy and decision-making for issues like the next pandemic or climate change or food security issues.
Mm-hmm. That is so broad that it's now we have the whole world to work with, because that's almost as broad as what my project does. Project Save the World, So
well, it's broad, but it's not.
Yeah.
So I've worked on everything from sea star epidemics to impoverished communities in Nepal, to global policies, but they all come down to the fundamental same issue of how do we create a social and ecological setting for things to be well? How do we maintain options and resources so things can act in a way that's healthful for them? And so although it's very broad, I'm able to act broadly by coming back to those foundational principles of, well, what do we have to change to keep things well?
That's beautiful. Okay. You've already touched an interesting point for me, which was that about 15 minutes ago, I was reading about sea stars, believe it or not, and not an epidemic, or maybe, I don't know whether they were or not, but I've become interested lately in the possibility of using a seaweed as a means of reducing carbon. It captures carbon big time, as well as trees do, and a lot of it goes to the bottom of the ocean. And apparently there's an interaction among sea otters and sea urchins and sea stars. So although I got as far as reading about the connection between the otters and the sea urchins, I didn't find out what it had to do with sea stars. So please enlighten me.
Well, it's hard to say what you're reading there. I think the enlightenment there is, I think you hit at a very key point. You're saying you're looking at seaweed to capture carbon, which gets people to say, well, let's produce more seaweed, not realizing that seaweed's connected to other living things. It's connected to the otters who might need some types of seaweed for physical security. And they've got urchins that they eat. And if the otters aren't there, the urchins eat the seaweed, and sea stars are another predator. So we tend to still want to manage the world, which is a complex system, by finding a single point intervention. Mm-hmm. And not opening our view to say, well, what if we put all this seaweed here? What if it's not the right type of seaweed? What if we put too much seaweed here? Because we tend to look at these, single fixes for very broad problems. Mm-hmm. And so I think your analogy there, your story is that seaweed might be good to capture carbon, but it's the seaweed system we have to think about, and its connection to the other things, including us. And that's very difficult in decision-making in any field, whether it's resource management or health, because both our training and our legislation has added you to think about this, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm an algologist. I study seaweeds and I do this, but I might not study the socioeconomic impacts of foreshore management. I'm making that up as an example.
No, I think that's a beautiful example.
So what we haven't done, what we desperately need is something that I call a specialized generalist, right? Okay. Somebody who has a specialty in their discipline but it also has specialty in being general and thinking about things, right? We have trained tremendously adept methodologists in their field and very few broad thinkers. And we need those sorts of people to come out and say, okay, how do we have an enhanced seaweed ecosystem so we have win-win-win situations? So we have something that's equitable for us, for the, for the sea otters, for the sea urchins, and for those who will depend on it later on. And that's a challenging thing to get people to think about, and a very challenging thing to get done legislatively.
Absolutely. And I've heard that one of the obstacles is that there are so many regulations right now inhibiting people who actually want to get started with farming seaweed, that's really the problem. They can't get permits because they have to fill out, I don't know, too many forms, or it takes too long to get it through the bureaucracy. But, when you talk about generalists, my ears flap, because I've always thought of myself as what Isaiah Berlin called I think a fox. The thing he wrote, which he was surprised it became so popular, was a distinction between two types of people. Those people who know a little bit about something, a lot about one little thing, and he calls those hedgehogs, and they are specialists, and they know tremendous amount, but only a very, very narrow specialty. And then there are other people who don't know much, but we know a lot about a lot of things. So I'm a fox. That's the type that I like to talk about a whole bunch of things that I don't know enough about. But the beauty of it is I get to talk to people who sometimes are specialists and who can enlighten me a little bit, even though I don't absorb everything that I'm given from these specialists. So I think there needs to be a more cooperative relationship between hedgehogs and foxes. And you've come to a fox's den today.
Well, it's just like a natural ecosystem. No natural ecosystem works well with only generalists or only specialists. And neither does the ecosystem of ideas. So we need people to dive down deep, who can really get into that topic. But you also need the people who can dabble and just ask questions. The value of being a generalist is you don't get, this isn't the right word, but I'll use it. You don't get indoctrinated by your discipline. You have to ask, well, how do you know that? And sometimes people haven't thought about those sort of things. And so the generalist perspective allows you to ask questions about why. The specialists are very often very good on the hows and the whats, and on many of the whys, but you just believe things happen. Well, I when I went to veterinary school, I learned that you treat this with that, and I used it because that's what I saw and that's what I learned. I wasn't exposed to this way of dealing with the problem. I remember when I was doing my PhD in epidemiology, that I was getting quite cocky and arrogant that we epidemiologists, we have a broad view of what health is. And these, the pathologists or the clinicians have a very, very view of what health is, because we look at all these determinants, all these issues, and we think broadly about systems. And as I was studying for my comprehensive exams, I just took a break and watched a documentary on TV about the history of health in Asia, and recognized there was a completely different paradigm of how we think about health in Asia versus North America. And it just struck on me right then that I actually have a very, very narrow view of what health still is. Indigenous perspectives have a different view of health, right? And somebody, if you get stuck in your discipline, you get stuck in that one worldview. And I've always said, if you use everything you know to solve a problem, you're still limiting your options, because there's always somebody who knows something else.
Well, can you tell me a little about what I've been missing about Asian views of health? Because there's something I haven't picked up yet.
Well, I think it's too broad to say Asian views, because views in India about health and what it could be can be different than ancient views or current views of Chinese medicine, which can be different from where in Vietnam, for example. But for me, the break when watching that documentary was actually to take us back even to the roots of indigenous thinking and Hippocrates, right? Hippocrates wrote something called Airs, Waters, and Places, where he was trying to instruct young physicians about how to figure out if somebody's sick. Because in Hippocrates' day, they didn't have, molecular tests and CAT scans and stuff like that. Hippocrates, you had to know about the person and how they lived. So if you lived near a swamp and you had this type of housing, you're more likely to be sick with this, which we know now is malaria, but he didn't know that at that time. So Hippocrates says something like, it's better to know the person that has the disease than the disease that has the person.
Mm-hmm.
And I recognize that much of my Western training, we were much more interested in the disease that had the person or the animal or the whatever.
Mm-hmm.
We have very biomedicalized health, as opposed to health being the capacities and the resources to deal with it. You have the life that you have. Now, in Western views, we see that sort of stuff, certainly in indigenous knowledge, but also in fields like health promotion and population health, where health is the capacity to deal with everything that life throws at you. But at the time when I was training as an epidemiologist, I'm going to do a mathematical model. I'm going to say drinking this much red wine has a probability of causing this problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that's still reducing something very complex into this very sort of linear, unrealistic approach. So I'm not saying, again, one's better than the other, just like a fox isn't better than a hedgehog. They serve different purposes. Mm-hmm. And by seeing that entire ecosystem of ideas, I may expose myself to diversity of solutions I wouldn't have thought about if I'd stayed in my specialty.
Well, I think you're a fox too, and I love it. So at any rate, you're a fox of an epidemiologist, right? Okay. So what are some of the issues that you have taken on? Tell me about your own work history or your own current fascinations. What are your projects? What do you think that you need to solve right now? What bothers you? The kind of knowledge that you need to acquire that you don't have and you yearn for.
Yes. What do I yearn for? That's a challenging question. And maybe let me try to give a bit of history to get to the answer. So as I was mentioning to you earlier, once I left sort of clinical practice and started doing epidemiology, I was working on emerging infectious diseases. And this was back in the very early 90s, where we're just starting to see these emergent diseases coming. In fact, many people counseled me against working on infectious diseases because we're winning the war on them, chronic disease. And that is true. Chronic disease is a huge burden on human health and well-being. But I started working on these issues. And I worked on one particular disease of salmon. And at that time, the veterinarians would find the sick salmon, collect them, send them off for tests and get a diagnosis and figure out things from there. And I was working on an outbreak of a disease. And an old colleague of mine said to me, "Craig, have you gone scuba diving?" I said, "No, the vets, they don't do that. The samples aren't good for diagnostic tests. And, we can't figure what's going on." And he says, "Isn't that like trying to understand the diseases of cattle by looking through a hole in the barn wall?" I thought, well, what does he mean? So I literally immersed myself into the population to understand the population within its context. And that was my very first lesson about understanding context when you're trying to understand a health issue. Finished my PhD and I got a job in human public health. And a colleague of mine who was a medical health officer and I were walking down the street. And this was years before One Health was ever coined as a term. And he said to me, "Craig, your job is to look after the health of animals as a veterinarian. Mine's to look after the health of people. I'm not sure who does animals, but whose job is it to pull it all together?" I said, "Well, it's nobody's job." He said, "Well, why don't you make it yours?" So I left my academic position and started a nonprofit called the Center for Coastal Health. Again, never called it One Health, but we started to look at problems from a collective perspective. Mm-hmm. And we try to help people deal with whether it was an environmental health issue or a disease outbreak issue or a poverty issue, by trying to think about that issue within the system, within the context that those people or those animals live. So it began to shift me away from much of my training, which was I always say to students, as an epidemiologist, I was a retrospective genius. You come in after the disease's outbreak has happened, and you try to explain why it happened. Uh-huh. But how can I think forward? So I was thinking about this context, thinking about, and that shifted me from health as dealing with disease to health with creating wellness. And that was trying to think about, how do I make sure things have the access to the needs for daily living, food security, water security, physical security? How do they have resources to cope with stresses and changes? That could be, for me, it could be money in the bank, could be a resource. For a deer in Saskatchewan, it could be fat in the bones before it goes into a hard winter. How do I make sure? And then how do I match the evolved needs of these animals or those people with the expectations we put on them? And that was a huge mind shift to start thinking about creating situations for things to be well. Now, most literature in this area is the thing is us. But recognizing that to keep us well, I've got to keep them well, and them being the other species and the other and the ecosystems, right? Mm-hmm. So that's sort of been my career trajectory. My big interest right now is how do we break our status quo, which is a siloed approach to issues in training and legislation and in practice. And what I think is a disenfranchised and disempowered generation who has grown up with nothing but bad news. So my children are now in their early 30s, late 20s, and they have grown up with 24-hour news that has only ever provided them with problems and never solutions. Mm-hmm. So many younger people are going, this is beyond me. They see the obstacles or not these solutions. So how can I empower the next generation to feel they can make change in what appears to be overwhelming odds by trying to preserve the resources we all need, all species and all generations, to stay well?
Brilliant. Yeah. I've been losing sleep about what I mean, they're not just young generation people who are conservative. I mean, I've been consulting some friends about actually regenerative agriculture. I have some ideas of things might happen, but the first thing they give me is all the reasons why it's not a reasonable proposal. And it isn't that I want to rule those out. I want to investigate all the reasons why things won't work, but I don't want to have that be the only thing that one is looking for. I would like it if they'd start with, well, here's how what you're proposing might work. Here's the possibilities in this. And then, of course, you do also want to consider all the reasons that it might not work. But this conservatism, which I think is extremely widespread, or I would call it kind of fatalism. It's a kind of pessimism about what is possible instead of an active search for what may work, and being willing to sort of take a chance on looking for something that we need desperately now, because God knows we're in an emergency and we don't have time to test out everything as much as we'd like. But we know what are the most promising things that we can do. So my current preoccupation is to look for things that we can actually begin to do right now with the resources that are, available and accessible, that we might actually have some discernible effect within 5 years. So I'm making a list. What's on your list of things that we might be able to do right now that might have an effect within 5 years? A little bit of an effect in Canada.
Yeah, I always challenge people to the 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years. What are you going to do? What can you do? And so I think that, there's two things you brought up there. I tend to think it's an issue of empowerment rather than conservatism. And so empowerment is, I believe I can do it. I know I can do it. The social norm is to do it. My colleagues will think it's okay to do it. All those sorts of things have to be in there. And so we have systems, say, of people are worried about promotion and tenure systems in academia if they try to be too risky and don't get their publications. We have people in government who are worried about risks of contradicting their government. We have people who don't have the training to think broadly. So we start thinking about empowerment. There's multiple ways we can start to influence change, rather than just don't be afraid, try it. Come on, take a risk. We have to make them feel the confidence, the capacities, and the acceptance to do those sorts of things. So I think that's really important. The other thing I think that you and I are similar on, everything that you just said there is a big part of what I'm trying to do, is take the idea of harm reduction for drug addiction and put it onto big and global health problems. And I say this for this reason. So harm reduction and drug addictions and alcohol addictions and other addictions basically said, we're not going to get rid of heroin. We're not going to get rid of fentanyl. It's been around for a long, long time. And they realized this, of course, when the HIV epidemic came along, that we're having this concurrent outbreak of HIV infections related with drug use. Now, we could say, quit using drugs, stop using drugs, but people will find a way. Well, maybe what we can do is reduce one of those harms by giving clean needles, for example. So harm reduction is saying, look, it would be nice if the harmful thing was gone, but how can we incrementally reduce the harms to the individual, to the community, to society by working with who we are working with now, what they know, the resources they have, rather than trying to have a preferred future that's not going to happen. So I use that because society is addicted to consumption and fossil fuel use. They are addictions where they, just like a drug, they get an immediate positive effect out of it. I can drive my car, I can go on a plane, I have the new TV, and the benefits are hypothetical. So just like I get my high when I use my drugs, there's a benefit. So using some ideas of harm reduction thinking, like meeting people where they are, using the knowledge you have, making incremental gains so you can see that working towards shared goals are very similar to what you're talking about, but are not very common, particularly like we were talking about in the One Health world. That concept isn't there. That concept is still, here's a problem. So it starts with the problem really often, the absence of health, a disease outbreak, and it often devolves down to a classical biomedical epidemiological way to solve that problem. Now that's a very broad brush statement. I make that broad brush statement because my graduate student just finished a review where 70 to 80% of all One Health populations follow that, our publications follow that model. The other 20% are trying to work over here with what we call health promotion and population health, but they're the rare duck in the One Health world. So I think starting to think about that harm reduction of saying, yeah, we can't have the ideal thing. We are not going to stop the next pandemic. There's going to be a pandemic. There's multiple pandemics going on right now. There's an African swine fever one. There was a sea star one. There's many pandemics in other species. Of course, we're going to get another one. But how can we set up systems that we can be more robust to them so we can deal with them when they come? We can recover more quickly. The impacts can be contained. What can we do now to incrementally decrease that risk? Instead of doing all our research, for example, to find hot spots of a disease emergence, why don't we find cold spots and protect the cold spots? Mm-hmm. You know, for example, how can we build on those that are doing things that well? So the harm reduction approach, I think, could really help bridge the desire of One Health to be dealing with these big planetary issues and the reality that the vast majority of One Health is veterinary public health, classic veterinary public health, which is very much needed, has always been needed, but lost fashion in the 80s and 90s.
Okay, well, now that was, I hadn't even thought at all about the notion of needle. We used to have one here in Toronto, and I don't know whether it still exists or not, and it's always apparently very controversial, a place where addicts can go and do their injection safely.
Yeah, and now in British Columbia, can you actually give those addicts safe drugs? So there's a group of people who very much say, drugs are bad, drugs should be gone. You're enabling all the bad behavior through that. Mm-hmm. There's plenty of research that shows harm reduction actually is very helpful for getting people off drugs, for doing community. Just like there's people who are saying, we should all go to, it should be, no factory farms, no fossil fuels, no this. That's unrealistic. That is not the way, that would be a preferred future. Somebody needs to fight for that preferred future, but somebody has to also be making things less harmful in the reality of the world we live in. Mm-hmm. Right? If we put all our energies into arguing for preferred future without anybody paying attention to, let's make sure we aren't perpetuating to use the drug analogy, we're not perpetuating an HIV outbreak. We're not perpetuating violence against addicts. We're dealing with mental health issues of people on the street, right? Mm-hmm. Somebody has to be doing that. At the same time, we're trying to figure out how do we rid society of harmful drugs? Same thing should happen with climate change. Same thing with the extinction crisis. Same thing with all these issues that I have a preferred future here, but I'm a pragmatist that says, in the meantime, that's not going to happen in my lifetime. What can I do to decrease the harms? And if nothing else, build society a little bit more breathing room to deal with these big problems. Because if we don't act now to create that breathing room, we will not have time for the preferred future.
You just said something that, made me think twice. You said something that I want to explore, that by doing the harm reduction, you actually are also reducing, what was it? The likelihood that people will, for example, with drug use, that if you if you do things like safe places for injections, that it makes it easier for people to get off drugs completely? Is that what you mean to say, or was that just a passing?
Well, yes. I mean, the harm reduction program is more than needle exchanges.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not an expert in drug addiction, so
Right.
please don't anybody. I will likely say things that are incorrect. This is just an analogy I'm using. So, for example, I was talking to some street nurses in the downtown east side of Vancouver, providing a meal program, making sure that drug users were well nourished, greatly increased the likelihood they would stop using drugs and they could stay in detox programs. So that's not getting rid of the drugs. That's supporting those people. It's not judging them, to help them have the resources to get to a better future themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That goes back to, we were talking about making a healthful situation. Housing, feeding, fairness are really important things to allow people to put into that space where they can deal with the addiction they have. So the question becomes, what are those equivalents for climate change? Or what are those equivalents for peace and prosperity in communities? Finding jobs for young men in places of conflict can reduce conflict because they have a purpose and they have a job, things like this. It's not necessarily getting rid of historical conflicts, but it's helping to reduce that harm. So what can we do for climate change? People are still going to, look at right now, people are flying it all over the place for their summer holidays. The airports are packed with people, right? And they're going to do that. At the same time,
well, I don't know, damn it. When I have a friend who wants to go to a wedding in Peru or something, I am the first one to say, I don't think you should do that. And because I do think we have to say some things we just really have to look at. I don't think there should be cruise liners, for example. These people who go off on these long pleasure trips that emit enormous amounts of CO2 on ocean liners. I think we have to abolish them. So I'm much more radical on that point than maybe you would like for me to be.
So this is where we learn from harm reduction, because that's been the philosophy. I don't think there should be heroin in communities. I don't think there should be fentanyl. We should stop that. And we know through most addictions that bans don't work. Right? There has to be something other than bans. And I agree with you. Cruise ships, they shouldn't exist. But there are people who have their cruise ship addiction. There are people who are going to go to that. So while we are trying to say that shouldn't happen, can you in fact make that thing less harmful? So this isn't an either or situation. You don't say, oh, I'm happy to make sure that there's harmful substance still going if I can reduce their harm. No, that's the long-term goal. It's just you can't ignore the short-term efforts. So the question becomes, if your friend is going to go to Peru to say, my social value is that you shouldn't go, we know that doesn't work with addictions of any sort. Why is it going to work with addictions too that we have to consumption and again, fossil fuel-based travels? So I think we have to have a more fulsome, I always talk about the continuum of care, right? We have to be able to recover people and ecosystems from the disasters that have happened. We have to make sure that anything that's causing a problem can be made less of a problem. We have to try to prevent the problems and have to try to keep things good. It's not one or the other. So we don't have a healthcare system that only has a coroner. And we don't have a healthcare system that only does population health. We have a coroner and an emergency room and a GP and population health and health promotion.
Okay, but I'm still stuck about 4 paragraphs behind, because when you said, let's make it less dangerous to take cruise ships, my mind started whirling around thinking, what could we do to make cruise ships less polluting? Mm-hmm. Now let's play with that. Mm-hmm. I mean, I haven't given that a single moment's thought, and I think it's a very interesting approach. So give me some help here. What could we do together? Let's think of things that we could do to make cruise ships less polluting. I don't know.
So let's talk about travel. Let's talk about travel in general. So right now there's a local airline, small airline, that ran its first flight on a battery operated airplane. Granted, it was from Victoria to Vancouver. It wasn't a long flight, right? But they've been a carbon neutral airline for a number of years. So there's practically that can change.
Sorry, hold on. How could they be a carbon neutral airline already?
Well, with this particular one, they're doing it through hydroelectric power for a battery. In the past, they did it through offsets. That's how they claim to be carbon trade.
Accounting, a creative accounting. That's all that is.
Sure, that's a whole other issue. Talk about that. So the cruise industry, and again, I'm not defending it whatsoever, but there are issues of food sourcing, water sourcing, the luxuries that they provide on the cruises, the amount of time they sit idling, picking their routes. All those things can reduce. It doesn't make them good. It makes them less bad. But the other issue we have to think about, if all of a sudden you said no cruise ships, the economic implication of the Caribbean is huge. Right now in the Caribbean, with lack of travel during the pandemic, the impacts on the well-being of people there has been significant. So it's the same when people say, we must stop the wildlife trade. There are many, many people whose lives and their children's lives depend on being able to hunt those animals for food or to be able to participate in the trade where they can make income. And there's no other alternative, right? So we have to be careful of these unintended consequences of bans that meets our preferred future, but it impacts other preferred future. And quite often, we almost risk another form of colonialism when we are going to tell people whose entire economies depend on those cruise ships, you can't have them anymore, but we're not going to help you transition. So that's like saying to the drug addict, you can't have heroin anymore, but break your addiction on your own. That's not fair. That's not just.
Then let's say that we take you seriously and we have to take care of the people in the Caribbean whose lives depend on servicing the tourists who come on the cruise ships. Well, my concern is more than anything else about the amount of CO2 that's emitted by these cruise ships. I mean, I saw numbers at one point. It was just staggering. Why don't we say that these cruise ships, instead of floating around spending half their time on the ocean, going from one place to another and emitting more and more and more. Let's say the people who go should go and stay on, let's say they're going to Jamaica, and they should go and the cruise ship should stay there for 3 weeks, and these people on the ship should live very comfortably, but they should get off and do something interesting and worthwhile in Jamaica that would enable the Jamaicans to feed them and look after them and get some money that way, but where these people would actually be doing something worthwhile.
So yeah, that's one possibility. But the other one, let's be a little bit more radical. The fundamental question is a question of incentives and disincentives. So for example, what if we gave incentives, we'll stick with Jamaica for your example, or some country, it could be any cruise anywhere else, to have an alternative economy to the cruise line. Because right now, for many of them, some countries are held hostage by those, because that's a major part that tourism is a major part of their economy. Can we figure out ways to have economic diversification so that the risk of saying to the cruise ships, you can't come here when you have a drought and suck all our water away for your cruises, which some of them do on some islands, there is the ability for them to resist that. So again, instead of saying to anybody who's addicted to that source of income, just break that addiction, but we'll give you no alternative, that's not going to work. Similarly, what are the disincentives to people who take the cruises? Well, what reduced tobacco use? Taxation, right? So cruises are cheap holidays for a lot of people. Maybe they shouldn't be. Maybe you have to pay for that luxury to damage the earth, right? So, I mean, we have to think about incentives and disincentives because the moral arguments haven't worked. I shouldn't say that. I mean, there has been many successes over the years. The overall trend has not been good, but there have been wins in all sorts of things in the environment. I mean, again, I can remember as a child, the first Greenpeace posters coming out to stop whaling. Well, most countries, not all of them have stopped whaling. Doesn't mean that whales are doing well, but we have to. It goes back to the earlier conversation. You and I are falling into the trap, or maybe I'm taking us into the trap. I'm not offering a vision of hope and possibility, right? That the young folk, this is the big problem. We can't do this. Jamaica will do that. We have to do this. And if they just do what I say, they'd be better. But we know they don't. We need to be able to find these examples of success. And I try to get a special issue of a journal that I was editing on sort of these old One Health, EcoHealth issues. Send me papers of successes and tell me why you succeeded.
Beautiful.
I could not get enough in the community for a special issue.
Ah, really?
Right? And the reason for that is twofold. One is our training in the sciences has to be, if we don't have 100%, we still haven't got the answer. So I haven't succeeded because I haven't stopped all of world poverty. I haven't stopped all of the cruises. I haven't saved all the species. I haven't succeeded. Right? That was the one problem.
Yeah.
And the second problem is often our funding, our investment in these programs are for 2-year or 5-year, where the changes we want are multiple. They take multiple long-term investment. And we're not good at long-term investment in our research and our programs. And so, we have to stop talking about my preferred future, your preferred future, and why you should do it, to actually show people paths for incremental improvement. We're back to our harm reduction. I know I want you to be off this drug, but maybe I can get you here where you're not infected with hepatitis at the same time, and you're better nourished, and you have social support. So now we can get you to the point where you can stop that drug.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we start looking at our planetary problems like that too, to help people make the right choice. And that's what health is all about,
now,
right?
Another thing that is, I think, a factor in this, the reason it's easier to report on failures is because there are more, but also because the success often requires a whole lot of organizing at a much larger scale than is easy. I mean, if we want to have, for example, find ways of introducing alternatives in the economy of Jamaica, so that they can afford to consider having a cessation of the cruise liners, then we have to work with all kinds of other people, especially Jamaican government and other, business people and maybe farmers and who knows, seaweed gardeners in Jamaica. And organizing people globally is just so much harder. That's why I'm thinking in terms of, let's look for things that we can do that do not require the permission or even require, say, Canada to consult with other countries and get their agreement. So I'd like to work on, for example, what to do with the sea ice in Hudson Bay, because Canada owns Hudson Bay. We don't have to ask anybody's permission if we want to do something like spray seawater over it, if that's what we want to do. So that's something we can do ourselves without having too much cooperation, because it's the cooperation globally that is really important and more important, but is not getting any easier than ever. If anything, it's getting harder because there are all these right-wing governments that block things that we might want to do that would be helpful even to them.
And so I think I often tell students, we have to learn to do things despite the government, because in the past, when it's a public good, well, the government should do it. It's the government's job to do that. Well, it's a public good, and I'm a member of the public. And while the successes on the globe can be small, the successes at the local scale are many and often not discussed. So there's an island here in British Columbia who was dealing with failing septic systems and contaminants going to the ocean, who built a marsh that can bioremediate, for example. And this is a local scale. And there's individuals who have made changes. So all great movements start locally, and all change is ultimately local. And so there, again, you're right. There's got to be people working at that UN level. But I want to make sure that the message isn't, well, once they decide, they'll do it for you. Again, how do we empower people to make healthy decisions for themselves, their community, and their shared environment at a personal, at a community? And so we have, again, just like I talked about the continuum of care from a health system, we have to have that continuum of intervention. I'm really glad there's somebody negotiating things at the UN. That will never be me. I'm not in those spheres. But maybe I can talk with that community in Nepal I'm working on about this disease to change something that's healthy for them. It's not hurting the other environments. It's not hurting the other species. So I think, again, we have to have actors working across that full spectrum. And if we go back to the discussion you and I had before this recording, if we're going to empower the next generation coming up, they have to believe that what they do makes a difference. And having them see that change it's going to be easier to do at a local level because very few of them are going to work at the UN, right? And if we have the narrative that it's up to them to fix climate change, we're hooped, right? So again, we have to have people working across all those different levels.
I respect what you're saying, but it troubles me because I think, just as I said, there's hedgehogs and foxes. There are two different types of people. There's also local and global. Mm-hmm. And some people think locally and some people think globally. And I'm a global one.
And we need all of them. A hedgehog is not better than a fox.
Yeah.
Right? One is not better. They're both perfectly evolved to their roles.
But right? When you said everything starts at the local, okay. Now, do I want to believe that? I'm not sure whether it is true, but the question is, do I want to believe that it's true? I'm not sure because I'm not a local person. I really don't know anything about the local school board or even who's my MP. My MP, do I even know that? Yes. I mean, I can figure these things out if I stop and think, but mainly I'm more likely to know about who's running for mayor of London than I am who's running for mayor of Toronto. It's just, that's the way
And I've always been concerned. I've done this over and over in multiple disciplines. Medical health officers, chief veterinary officers, environmental people. When I say to them, do you know where your dinner came from? I always wanted to have it. I used to teach a course called Animals, Health, and Society. And I always wanted the final exam to be a potluck dinner. And the students and the exam question was, create and defend the healthiest meal for you, your community, other species, and other generations.
Wow.
Right? And so to ask them, I never did that because universities don't like that exams. I did something else that I got in trouble for, but that's another story. But it also would take students to I would take them to the wildlife section of the grocery store. So go to the wildlife section? I said, yeah, we're going to the seafood section. Most of that's wildlife, right? Wild salmon is wildlife. Wild rockfish is wildlife. Let's go into the wildlife section. And I want you to pick the healthiest choice. And it would stymie the students because they'd bring something that's good for, this has good omega acids for my heart. Yeah, but that's a 60-year-old animal that you've taken out of the reproductive cycle. Okay, well, I'll get this thing here. Okay, that one's come in from Vietnam now, so you've got a carbon footprint. Okay, this one's salmon are highly contaminated now, so they've got the. And but the students had never thought about this. And if you don't know where your food and water comes from, how do you care about the world around you?
Well, some of us do. Some of us do care about the world around us, but
many don't.
It's true that we're not very responsible when it comes to knowing what to pick off the grocery shelf. You are right. I mean, some people would call that hypocrisy. They would say I'm a hypocrite because you're right. I'm one of those people who would not have a clue about where my food came from.
The carbon footprint of the banana. All choices are local choices, whether it's consumerism, choices to go to that wedding in Peru, right? So ultimately, all change is a decision that somebody has to make. And those decisions can be impactful at the local as well as at the international level. Because there have been many, 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 many international agreements that have created no change whatsoever. Because there wasn't incentive to act.
But I am also, my grievance or my complaint tends to be the other way around. I think, I'm just disgusted with people who, when you talk about what can you do to stop climate change, they say, well, ride a bicycle. As if now that's going to make a difference. Or be sure and turn out the lights when you leave the room. I'm sorry, but you better think bigger than that. Because
but again, you're falling into either or thinking. It's this and that, not this or that. Right?
Yeah, but I just plain don't think that that's a very important place to put your energy, is to make sure you turned out the lights. I mean, I just think
if it empowers somebody that they feel they are contributing, that has a huge impact of changing their psyche and the social norm. And the social norm influences the way voters vote. Right? So you have to think about how that's changing the mindset of the individual as well. Because we have a generation of hopelessness. And it's hopelessness because there's nothing I can do. Now, I agree, many corporations are downloading responsibility to the individual. If you turn out your lights, meanwhile, they're having record profits over here. Right? Again, it's not a this or that. The harm reduction thinking, we're not judgmental. We're trying to make changes where we can make changes and empower the people that's within their scope of control to do something. Right? And I think that's important.
Yeah, but you do have to make choices. I got into an argument, or not an argument, but I kind of got my feelings hurt about 20 years ago when the pastor of my church got a little peeved with me because every Sunday morning, she would bring tons of food down to the church and have a big breakfast for all of the local homeless people. And she needed a lot of the church people to come and help do it. And I said, well, that's not how I want to spend my time. And she thought, I'm not really following Jesus because Jesus took care of poor people. And that's what charity really amounts to. And I claimed I've got more important things to do. I'm sorry, I didn't put it that way, but that's what I really meant. So, okay, it's about how to spend your time.
But that's okay.
You do have to choose. If I went down there
you just made my point. You just made my point, though. You made my point. It is about choices, and different people have different sets of value systems, and we have to be able to develop something that people can make positive choices within their interests and within their abilities. There were some people. I remember my son when he went to with high school. They went down to Dominican Republic. They were going to go down there and help build a school. So he had traveled a little with us, but hadn't seen poverty and hadn't seen people living in shanties. And he came back to me and he said, I get it, Dad. I said, what do you mean? He said, I would kill the last of an endangered species to feed my child. Yeah, you would. If you were a starving family, you would. So what's the solution? We've got to help those people not be starving families, right? We've got to make sure they have other options, all these sorts of things. So again, it's not a this or that, it's a this and that. And you try to make the changes that help people see if your fellow parishioners had worries about homelessness and they felt they were doing good, and it is good to help that homeless person. It is good to give them some food. It is good to show them respect. Those are good things to do. But if we weren't thinking about a housing policy, social equity programs, mental health problems, that would just keep coming. So now you've described my career trajectory. I'll go to this emerging disease. I'll go to that emerging disease. I'll keep working with them. I'll understand them, but I'm not dealing with the stuff up here that's, like I said to you, I was just documenting demise, which is why I started moving away from just that issue. But I've recognized you have to have that continuum. And that takes us back. What I think is quite funny, you email me to say, let's talk about One Health. and we're talking broadly about quite an enjoyable conversation. But this is One Health in my view.
I absolutely agree.
It is this holism.
I think it's a very important conversation, frankly. I mean, I hope a lot of people think about this because actually I don't have any good answer now. You just left me with what's my comeback to what you just said? I don't have a comeback because you do have a continuum and there are different places to make a contribution. But my concern is always, where's the best place? Where do you insert your wedge in the crack in order to to make the most impact?
And you're speaking, I don't know you at all. I read about it on the website. You're speaking from a privileged position because you have a very different wedge that did that homeless farmer in Nepal I worked with.
Yeah.
Right. So you use the way. So I remember years ago, I was a volunteer fire department. I was a member of our volunteer fire department. And we learned something called the span of control. So when I was on rescue, I did not put the fire out. My job was to rescue that person. I didn't run over and try to even if I saw that fire. If I was on attack, I didn't do rescue. Right. So what could I do to help the overall situation of this burning house with people inside within my span of control? Your span of control, having been part of a Nobel Prize winning group, having been a tenured professor, is very different than the span of control of a homeless person living on the streets of Nanaimo right now. Doesn't mean you both can't do something, right? But if we assume everybody has used the same wedge you use, the house will burn down.
Okay, I can relate to that. I like that. Now, how do we use what you just said to stop the sense of powerlessness? I mean, if I don't think it's up to me to go to somebody and say, you're in a position where you could go down to the church and help fix sandwiches for these people. So you should go do it. And you will feel better if you do it, because you will know that you're making a difference. That's
no, that is not your place. That is not your place. But the fact that you live in a society or a community that has that option for people who are so inclined to do that, they have options. So that's what all this One Health stuff is about, in my view. This intergenerational health perspective is we have to preserve options for people to make choices that are healthy for them, their community, and society. By decreasing biodiversity, we're reducing our options. By changing our temperature regimes, we're reducing our options. By changing wealth distributions, we're changing options for people. Diversity in ideas, in biology, in economies, in values is important because we have an unpredictable future. And if we constrain the options for people to do good within their span of control, we reduce options to make the world a better place.
I love that concept. Yes. Now that concept has mileage. The notion of increasing options, that I think can be useful in all kinds of settings,
And that's what it means to be healthy. Create the social and environmental circumstances that people have the options to make a good decision.
Okay, now
that's what it means to be healthy.
How do you use this? How are you spending your time using this kind of insight to promote whatever your option is that you've chosen to work on? What is it you're concretely doing that you think is the most promising way in which you can make a contribution?
Well, within my span of control, what I'm trying to do is break the historic yoke of specialization. I'm trying to show that people can do stuff by thinking innovatively outside their discipline. And you don't have to be a Einstein to do that. So again, I'm gonna age myself, but you'll relate. I mean, when I went to university and I wanted to find a journal article, I'd walk up to the library. We had something called Index Medicus, which had all the list of the journals for the last 4 months. You try to find that topic. Oh, it's in this journal, in that volume. Then you'd walk up to the stacks. You'd go through all the stacks, and you'd find that journal, and you'd find your paper. My best ideas ever I had came not from the paper I found, but the one was it above it, or in the same issue, or in the journal next to it. Okay? Mm-hmm. But nowadays, what we do is, I want to know this. I Google Scholar it, I PubMed it, I Web of Science it, whatever, on those keywords, and I get stuff with those keywords, right? Then their training is the same way. We're training and teaching in a way that we're finding what we want to know and what we need to know, rather than having serendipity, the opportunity for serendipity by looking at something else, looking at other people. So I've made an entire career of never having a unique idea. I have stole my ideas from other disciplines and put them in new situations, and in doing so, help change those situations. I'm stealing harm reductions from public health, bringing it into environmental and animal health issues.
Okay.
I've stolen issues of health promotion and written textbooks on wildlife population health, which are really just lifted off from the human health thing, but tailored to that audience. So what I'm trying to do is show people that they can break the status quo by just looking and talking to diversity of ideas. So we talk a lot about diversity and equity and inclusiveness ideas these days. It is not just diversity. I get worried when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion based on a racial characteristic rather than what a person brings to them from their cultural background, from their upbringing, from their intellectual development. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to do in teaching and training at a professional level and in educational programs, showing people that there is an alternative path that's viable by just looking a little bit more broadly.
How do you teach that? It's a neat idea. It's
I tell them stories, Meta. I tell them stories. Oh. I've had this odd career where, as I said to you earlier, I've worked around the world in everything from sea star epidemics, child poverty, to extinction crisis, to pandemics, and I bring stories. Stories are highly motivational. Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest things that drive young people to make career choices is to see role models. So I'm trying to
I
bring
love
myself and
this.
other people to do that. So they go, oh, I can do that, because many of the role models aren't doing that. The pressures are not there. The incentives are not there. So by having people go, well, if he did it, I can probably do it. That's probably more important than anything else.
That's beautiful. Well, it also ties into something that I wrote a book some years ago called Two Aspirins and a Comedy. And it was about how watching television, if you have the right TV shows, can help with health and culture. And I'm very, very interested in the notion that serial dramas can be so impactful because people watching these television shows for years at a time come to identify with and really have as a role model a particular character. And if you use that, you can make soap operas that change public opinion. The whole population will be influenced by so-and-so, a character who does the kind of thing that you're talking about. And there's a guy who named Sabido in Mexico who developed a method of writing the stories for soap operas that were intended to actually change public opinion about things like, whether they should get education for illiterate adults, adult education, or HIV, methods of reducing exposure to HIV, just getting people to use condoms. There was a whole series made just to ease people into thinking about maybe they should use condoms. In Africa, it was, and that kind of thing. So it turns out that kind of culture, technique is I think the most promising way in the world to actually encourage people to change their way of thinking. But you have to start with where they are, where the public opinion is. You start with people who think the way the average person in that society does. And then over a long period of time, maybe a year, could be 2 or 3 years, you move and have them encounter situations where it changes their opinion a little bit, and so on. And so at the end, you wind up with people, as in Mexico. The first example of it was, they were trying to get adults interested in the idea they could enroll in night school and learn to read and write. And so they called the Ministry of Education and they said, our last show is coming up now, so you better be ready for a whole onslaught of people who will want to sign up for night school or something. And the people said, oh, we've handled more than that for years. We can do that easily. And but it turns out that they were just swamped. The next day they had just more people than they could possibly do, because they wound up with a punchline that really indicated that an old man could actually learn to read and write. And here he was reading the stories, the letters that his grandchildren had sent him.
So there you go.
Yeah,
a success.
Yes, exactly.
A success. There are successes there.
Yeah, and I think I love the notion you mentioned that having a role model is exactly the way to change public opinion the most, or the culture.
We are a social creature.
Yeah.
Right. We depend on stories and those around us.
That's
and we
true.
know over and over again, the acquisition of new scientific knowledge does not change beliefs and behaviors very much at all. Right.
So you tell stories. That is just, you've made my day. I'm delighted to hear how you proceed, because that is exactly my favorite method, although I don't use it. I really love the idea. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome.
Good wishes. This has been fun.
Well, it was an enjoyable conversation. It wasn't where I thought we'd go in the conversation, but it was enjoyable.
Well, I never expect to do anything except to respond in the moment to whatever comes up. And in your cases, you've given me lots of opportunities or options of things that we could talk about, and it's been fun. Okay.
Good. Glad you enjoyed it.
Good wishes for your success in whatever you're doing there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week and sometimes more. This is episode number 493. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. And sometimes we even post the transcripts there. When you get to that website, look around because there are things being posted all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. And after you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for $20 Canadian per year through PressReader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace, and you'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.